Hello, and welcome to this session on Engaging Effectively with Governments, a Philippine Experience with Tanya Quijano, my fellow co-founder of EA Philippines. I'm Brian Tan, and I'll be the MC for this session. We'll be starting with a 21-minute talk by Tanya, then we'll move on to a live Q&A session where Tanya will respond to a few of your questions. You can submit questions using the box to the right-hand side of this video. You can also vote for your favorite questions to push them higher up the list. We will likely only have time for one or two questions, but you can still submit a lot, and Tanya can answer the rest via chat or after her talk. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this session. Tanya Quijano works as an independent monitoring and evaluation specialist on development sector projects, specializing in social protection. She has worked with national and local government agencies, international development organizations, as well as civil society and NGOs. She is currently involved in several COVID-19 projects to enhance access to social services in urban poor communities. She is also the co-founder of EA Philippines and helps to organize EA Asia's Regional Global Health and Development Subgroup. Here's Tanya.
Hello everyone, I'm thrilled to be invited to speak at the very first EAGX Asia Pacific Conference. I'm Tanya, and I've been working in the development sector in different capacities for several years now. And in 2018, I co-founded the Effective Altruism Community in the Philippines with Brian Tan and Kate Lopango. So EA resonated with me because, like most of you, I wanted to do good, but I also wanted to do the most good and be effective at it. It's something I'm still learning to do every day, and I'm glad to be part of this conference that helps me with that. Here's a bit about my journey. I already worked in the corporate sector and spent several years working for the Department of Social Welfare and Development before learning about EA. Today, I work as an independent monitoring evaluation consultant along with being a part-time EA community building grantee. While I'm no longer working for the government, my consultancy practice has often involved working with governments. So to this day, I think that working in and with governments is one of the best ways to make an impact because of the scale and depth of change governments can do. I'm here today to talk about my experiences engaging with the Philippine government, drawn from the perspective of an ex-government insider, a development consultant, and an advocate for social development policies. I will be featuring lessons from those experiences and would like to share with you strategies I found to be effective. So since this talk cites examples from the Philippines, not all the approaches I explain here may apply to all types of governments or the government where you're coming from. So governments are dynamic and can be influenced by a changing political, economic, and social landscape. I also have to mention, of course, that the causal evidence for these approaches have yet to be fully formed, and more research on this is needed. So I think this talk can be helpful for people or nonprofits who are pursuing projects or policy reforms that need support for the government, or the government's action is crucial in what they want to achieve. It can also be for people who are generally curious about how it is to work in the government or how to deal with government actors. As a side note, I did a talk a while back on why one should consider working in government, and that's linked in this slide. I was joined by other members of the EA Philippines community who were also working in government, and they talked about their own experiences there. So if you're interested, you can check out the link of the recording found on this slide. Now, before I begin, I want to tell you more about the Philippine government. And this may be similar or very different depending where you're coming from. So there is this notion that governments in developing countries reek of corruption and inefficiencies. In the Philippines case, to some extent, this is true. So according to the World Bank's worldwide governance indicators, the Philippines falls under the median percentile rank in terms of governance effectiveness and control of corruption. However, this should not entirely be a cause for despair. The government shouldn't be considered as a monolith. It is complex, and even with that, good performance and good policies could still exist. And I have to tell you that during my stint in government, I've also met officials and public servants that are genuinely committed in making social programs better and not just motivated by their personal interest. Now, I would like to share with you some key lessons and strategies for working with the government. And some of these you might have heard it before, but I'd like to help you put that into the context of working with governments. So, the first lesson that I have for you is that governments want to be understood, so know where they are coming from. So, we in the effective altruism community are committed in knowing what works best based on evidence and reason. And even while we think we know what is best, governments will not jump at it right away. People in the government you may talk with have been in those positions for quite a while, and some of them may believe that they've seen it all. Typically, they're trying to achieve multiple goals with very limited resources. And on the other hand, personal interest can be more pronounced when you work with people in local governments, and that influences how they make decisions. So, before approaching the government with your own ideas, do your homework and find out what's on their plate. Look at their priorities and the problems they are dealing with. That information could be written down on official documents such as annual reports and development plans. Or it could be directives from the leadership or the present administration of that government. Just a note, Asian governments tend to be hierarchical and they defer decisions to people in higher positions most of the time. So find out what is motivating their actions and figure out how to drive EA-aligned initiatives or policy ideas that could fit into that agenda. When you do, you might have to reframe your approach or even change the language that you normally use to connect with them. So be clear with what value you bring. Other than that, also take the time to find out what they have done before and acknowledge those efforts. This type of information may be easier to get if your government is more transparent. So, for example, I found out that Australia has a transparency portal where performance reports and financial data are uploaded and can be accessed by the public. So in the Philippines, we have our own version. We call it the Freedom of Information Portal. And I observed that the two portals kind of function differently. And Australia's, I have to say, is more organized, it's more accessible, and they have readily available data sets. So this tells us that the effort of knowing that information could differ depending on how open your government is. And next point, the last thing you want to do is pitch something that they've tried before and did not work. So some governments are not used to owning up to their mistakes, and you might not know about it unless it's published in a government audit. So you need to do more research on what didn't work for them. And you can possibly refer to findings by third-party evaluators or think tanks. So I say all this because while I was in government, I would find myself in meetings where organizations, both local and international, would propose grand plans or new technology but were blind to the current priorities or constraints of the agency. So those should be recognized so that the solutions you present to them can be received more openly. Or better yet, try to work out solutions with them. So just an example, when I was working as a consultant, I was tasked by an NGO to ensure the local government's nutrition and health programs. And I was told, you have to monitor this through a dashboard. So the first thing that I did was to carefully examine their existing monitoring systems and what's working for them and not working for them. I found out that government staff are burdened to report on various programs, and they make several versions of the same report but packaged for different stakeholders. So they put, a lot of effort reporting on the same thing. Knowing that, I did not want to add to that burden, and they will likely resent another dashboard or report. So we had to recalibrate our approach and instead pursue the system that can be integrated into what they currently have. We also had to streamline said indicators. So they really appreciated that we took the time to find out what they were already doing. We acknowledged their pain points and tried to address them and understood what their circumstances were. This exercise made them more open to explore solutions and work on solutions with us. So in the end, we were able to improve how they were monitoring their programs. Another thing that I'd like to mention related to this about knowing where they're coming from and what their agenda is. I think it would be really great to see how EA-aligned initiatives can factor into their systems and into their agenda. So through EA Philippines' local cost prioritization research and local charity effectiveness research, we discovered that there were at least two organizations working with the government on how to improve policies and to have a better impact. One of those is a food fortification initiative. So this is a Give Well Standout charity, and they were already working with government to fortify wheat with folic acid so that they can prevent newborn diseases. They have been working on this for several years, but they have signals of traction, and they believe that this can be really impactful. Another group is the Animal Kingdom Foundation. In the Philippines, animal welfare is still a relatively neglected cost area, but this specific group, which I should mention is also an open philanthropy grantee, has been working in the government to create standards for cage-free systems in the Philippines, and they believe that this could really impact the poultry industry. So EA Philippines is exploring ways that we can support both of these organizations. So again, with all that said, first lesson is to understand and know where they're coming from before you bring your ideas to them. Now we move on to the next lesson. So the second lesson is government engagement is for the long haul. Don't just convince, commit, and be consistent. So if you are a nonprofit or group approaching the government for the first time, know that there could have been countless partnerships that existed before that may have gone sour or fizzled out. So you have to demonstrate that you are a genuine partner for change in achieving these shared goals. So what do I mean about that? So this means that yes, you might be able to convince them about your idea or fit their priorities, but they do not necessarily trust you to move forward with it. So it's important to build trust. And building trust takes time, even with people you think you already have a connection with. So surely you can seek out champions who might be aligned with the proposal, or you already have a working relationship with them. But they have to trust you. And those connections can also change or be removed because of staff movements. So when you build relationships with government, demonstrate that you are committed in seeing this policy reform or this project through by keeping your networks both broad and deep. So it is important that you involve not just those who are you involve not just the contacts that are visible to you, but extend your engagement with contacts in the periphery as well. So you can do this by sending regular updates and continuing dialogue up to 2 levels higher or 2 levels down with your regular contact. So this is a proactive approach that shows that you really want to connect with them, and that's one of the ways that the government can begin to trust you. Another example of this is an advocacy group composed of the beneficiaries of the government's cash transfer program here in the Philippines. And they were pushing a legislation to institutionalize this specific social protection measure. So they did not only reach out to people within their own communities, but built relationships with different leaders and staff within the implementing department and other branches of government. So you have to understand, the department that was handling this cash transfer program changed their minister 4 times in the last 4 years. Yet they remained committed and with their policy reform, and they were also consistent with their engagement. So the group was able to follow up on agreements, and once they built their trust, the department relied on them to help in the implementation of the program itself. So it became a mutual and long-term relationship with this department. So, however, I also have to say that engaging effectively with governments means knowing what the limits of the relationship can be. So it's possible that as you review your own goals and working with government might not figure in too much into your strategy. So if that happens, what do you do? So find a way not to burn bridges. So for example, when I was working on a COVID-19 response project, we were able to influence a local government to distribute cash transfers and loans in vulnerable communities during the lockdown because this was previously prohibited. So we demonstrated that this scheme can ease the demand for massive relief pack operations, which are costly. So while that flagged to us an opportunity to work with this local government, it did not materialize in other projects because of different conditions. So what we planned was to pause a particular engagement, but we maintained our lines of communication open with them and still regularly updated them with our initiatives. So we remained consistent with them. So here you have to build trust over the long term when you're engaging with government, even when circumstances change. And you can be more effective in engaging with them if you demonstrate commitment and consistency. So that's lesson number 2. Now, for the third and last lesson. So governments tend to listen when the same message comes from different voices. So don't act alone and find allies. So governments tend to have competing priorities and they often talk to people and groups with contradicting interests. Another aspect to consider in Asia is that lobbying doesn't happen in the traditional way, in the way that this is understood in the Western context. So, for example, while in the Philippines you also have a law regulating or registering lobbyists, this isn't strictly enforced or not enforced at all. And in effect, anyone can be a lobbyist. So this makes the government prefer and seek groups that have a common position and with a plan that is workable and generates less friction. So gathering a common position can be difficult, but it can be done. So to do this, one must know how to identify and connect with allies and build coalitions within and outside of government that could speak for your cause. So building coalitions doesn't mean that everyone has to be in the same negotiating room. And this applies to opposing political parties that can't be seen working together but still have the same goal. So they can help from where they are. So who are allies? Allies can be influential officials or technical staff that can help build your case. These can be organizations within your own community or network that you share common objectives with. And these can be academics, members of the media, or ordinary citizens who can help amplify your message. So when the same messages are repeated over and over and maybe someone is rallying them, this could be you or your organization, more often than not, the government listens. So a good example of this is the initiative Coalitions for Change in the Philippines. Networks of organizations come together and they identify problems in reform areas. They co-create evidence-based solutions and they also build capacities and connections so that they can be in a better position to influence policy. So through trial and error attempts, because not everything works the first time, they were able to push forward technically sound and politically feasible proposals that resulted in actual policy reforms. So to illustrate this, the Philippines was just hit by successive typhoons just this month. And one of the reforms led by this coalition back in 2017 is streamlining the way local government units access calamity funds. So with this reform, local government units made it easier for them to access these funds and respond to ongoing disasters or prepare for disasters. And while I might say that this is still very challenging in the Philippines, some policy changes like this can help the government deliver services better. Another example that I'd like to talk about is the Philippines traffic problem. So in the Philippines, the traffic problem has been getting worse and worse, and government plans seem to be amiss on solutions that mattered, and it still contained proposals, for example, like road widening that was already found to contribute to traffic even more, but they were still there. So another coalition was formed. So this was the Move as One coalition, composed of students, civil society, groups from different sectors like businesses, legislators, local government officials, and they were able to make strides in allocating budget for transportation infrastructure that prioritizes the mobility of people over cars. So one of the pioneering members of this coalition is also very supportive of EA Philippines, and we were able to invite him in some of our talks as well. So these are examples of the allies. So you have the department secretary for public works and highways, you have a local government officials, you have members of the commuting public that doesn't have an organized voice before, but now they're organized, and you also have legislators who's pushing for the budget. So we've had some quick wins, and yeah, the government seems to be budging. So this approach seems to work in the Philippines because the Philippines has a strong and vibrant civil society sector, and more or less the government is open to speaking with them, though this could also fluctuate depending on what type of agenda you're bringing. And I believe that while this might work in the Philippines, there might be more considerations depending on the government you're working with, who might not have these constructive platforms for engagement. So, for example, the UAE Civil Society Index, according to the World Bank, is much lower than the Philippines, but they've been, slowly opening up. So, for people working in those types of environments, might have more considerations in the way that they pick their allies or what their allies should look like. So, yes, that could differ. But in the end, the lesson here is that if you have more voices talking about the same message, governments tend to listen. So don't act alone and find those allies that can speak for your cause wherever they may be. All right. So just to summarize, engaging with governments can be really impactful and it can be challenging, yes, because working with governments and with other stakeholders, it can be really messy. But it can happen even in these less desirable contexts as long as you are able to set up the right conditions to the extent possible and employ some of these effective strategies. And just to recap on our lessons. So, lesson one, understand where they are coming from by acknowledging their efforts, even their pains, and show that you have shared goals. Lesson two, engaging with governments takes time. You're in it for the long haul because you do not only need to convince them, but you have to be a partner that they can trust. And you can build this by demonstrating commitment and consistency. Lesson three, government tends to listen when there is a common message coming from different voices. So find allies that can speak for you and your cause wherever they may be. Okay, so that's it for me. Thank you for listening, and I hope that the ideas in this talk can help you with your projects. If you want to discuss more about this topic, feel free to reach out to me on the contact details on this slide or, use the event app. So catch you in the Q&A coming up. Bye.
All right. Thank you for that talk, Tanya. We only have time for a couple of questions, so let's get to it. The first question is from Pierce, and it's the top voted one. How do you deal with government agencies that have corrupt practices? Do you not engage with them? Or how about finding later down the line that they have corrupt practices? Would you try to disengage?
Okay, so there might be different perceptions in the way people think what corrupt practices are. Definitely, if it's blatantly, against the law and it's something that would put your organization and yourself at risk, I would definitely recommend not to directly engage with them, but to do more research on how other people or other groups have successfully engaged with that kind of agency that is known to be corrupt. And let's say, for example, you've already engaged with them and find out that they're doing corrupt practices. Definitely, there could be ways that you say no without really saying no. There are methods to do that, and I think that would be wise for your organization. Definitely, it would be a reputable risk, and especially a risk to the goals that you want to achieve.
All right. And then from Nigel, would you recommend engaging civil society groups as part of the rally for your policy advocacy?
Yeah, so based on experience in the Philippines, civil society has really moved a lot of reforms in terms of working with the government and their policies. So this is something that I would recommend. But then again, you also need to scan your environment. How open is the government really in engaging with civil society? And what should that engagement look like? So it would be good. I trust that the civil society would be effective in pushing forward your agenda. But as much as possible, try to have a common position with them, as I said in the talk, because that would make it easier, definitely, for the government to be more receptive.
All right. And then from Ayad, a lot of people could find it overwhelming to try and approach governmental bodies. What advice could you give to those people who are apprehensive about speaking to the people in charge?
Okay, so I think a good place or situation to start here is to go to some events or conferences where there are some decision makers. You can even try, if you're a student or someone who's interested in a certain type of agency, maybe try to do an internship there, because that kind of compels you to really interact with some decision makers. So those are the ways that I feel individuals could try to warm up with approaching, key people in the government. If not, find someone who might have a connection already and set up kind of an informal meetup with them. I think those would be the ways that could help you.
All right. And then for our last question from Amaris, do you think protests have been an effective way to engage and influence government here in the Philippines? And because there have been a lot of protests the last few years under this administration, some of which have involved students. And it would be great to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so in the Philippines specifically, you've seen a lot of this. I think I cannot say that it has been like consistently effective, because the government does tend to have like strong stances against certain types of agenda or interest. So for those that may be harder to push, because there are some agenda that the government, more or less based on their position, could possibly be more open to it. But for those that are harder to push, I think you have to be more creative, more than protest. It could be a different various ways to do so.
All right. So I'm sorry, but that's all the time we have. But thank you for all your questions, everyone, and for watching. I hope to see you all in the next sessions. And thank you, Tanya.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone.